In this video, I'll be philosophizing on the conditional criteria to constitute consent, meaning that one may brainstorm prior existing conditional criteria to think as to be more comfortable with engaging in certain sexual conducts and or not, meaning that conditional criteria may contain brainstormed as a must be good enough and necessarily necessary conditions. One connects certain underlying psychological needs satisfied in relation to the inferred BADAX cause effect dynamic associations, internal and or external validity works in relation to satisfying those underlying psychological needs appropriately. Only some meaningful underlying psychological needs are appropriate to satisfy to constitute the good enough and necessarily necessary conditions appropriate to the satisfaction of not only the certain underlying psychological needs, yet to provide consent and also to accept consensual agreements. Upon an ask, be it somebody is asking informally and or formally, engaging in verbal and or non-verbal behavior in which an individual is engaging the appropriate response in contrast to the inappropriate misconducts violating an individual's individual autonomy and or preventing and or violating the easier access to knowledge and or evaluation of one's clear head in terms of being able to clearly and more on the inter-categorical and or intra-categorical effectivenesses and efficiencies comprehend with clear communications existing to the mind-body connections, processing meaningful information within the mind-body connections to infer BAD AX cause effect dynamic associations in relation to the byproducts engaged in terms of the future-oriented inference one infers into the risks and or benefits in engaging in specific sexual conduct, be it one consents and or not, as one may provide consent and or disapproval as to provide no consent, and therefore if somebody were to engage in sexual conduct would be violating not necessarily always rape, though the bare minimum necessarily necessary conditions to constitute sexual misconduct, a serious violation of an individual's individual autonomy, and may cause unnecessary suffering amongst psychological distress, a breach of law amongst is inherently unlawful, to which there are severe punishments to appropriately correct the wrongdoing and or troublemaking. In the worst case, the troublemaker whom is a narcissist and or psychopath and or Machiavellian and or totalitarian, whom holds, and in some cases even perfectionists, whom hold authoritarian personality characteristics amongst totalitarian personality characteristics. All the troublemaking in terms of the personality characteristics operate in terms of some relation to totalitarianism amongst a tendency for often perfectionist thinking, yet not necessarily being a perfectionist, as perfectionism tends to be more domain specific when it comes to troublemaking. Concerning the lack of consent and or deliberations one is engaging in terms of satisfying and or brainstorming the only some conditional criteria, be it one may brainstorm more conditional criteria, yet have, say, one brainstorms 5 conditional criteria that would be appropriate. Maybe it's one needs to be able to get home at a certain time. It's hoping to at least let somebody other than the individual know where they're going to be for the night, not necessarily providing too much detail, but have some excuse to be able to, be it something happens, know somebody to be able to communicate duly and fairly the potential consequences one experiences in relation to that, amongst maybe is hoping to satisfy some sexual preference. So maybe the partner has to satisfy some sort of evaluation criteria, be it they're attractive enough and or maybe they don't smell too bad, or they tend to be polite instead of being too mean or harming others unjustly. So there's some brainstormed criteria, and satisfying the meaningful criteria one brainstorms allowances for more meaningful consensual agreements, be it that may sometimes, not always, practically be something one can foresee in terms of providing the most meaningful formal consent. Yet in terms of constituting the conditional criteria for informal consent, there are conditions where one may revoke consent and yet decide subsequently one may want to engage in certain sexual conducts, be it had the individual engaged in proceeding to engage in more sexual conducts would not necessarily be a misconduct, depending on the appropriateness of the approaching individual to engage that conduct, amongst the non-verbal hints as to provide more clear communications as to engage more consensual conduct appropriate. These hints are where conditional meaningful criteria are of most concern to the when in which one is thinking in terms of a time-bound constraint, allowing for an individual to provide and should provide more clear hints as to reduce unnecessary ambiguity, yet to hold some ambiguity in relation to potentially protecting oneself in relation to other individuals who might be attempting to engage the same, yet might be more undesirable in terms of engaging in some sort of sexual conduct and or sex, be it that one is more concerned with a certain individual should provide some more clear nonverbal communication, be it the best would be to provide more verbal communication, even if it's indirect, as to hint within more communications, be it through innuendo and or the change in pitch and tone to be able to calibrate one's underlying psychological needs. Certain psychological needs are being communicated within the meaningful communication clearly to increase the intra-categorical and or inter-categorical effectivenesses and efficiencies appropriate to the conducts to satisfy the brainstormed conditional criteria, optimizing the intra-categorical and or inter-categorical effectivenesses and efficiencies appropriate to engaging healthy psychological functioning consent, meaning that there are dysfunctions that may arise in terms of violations of consent, not having consent, and or providing consent and then revoking consent after the sexual conduct has been conducted, as to not constitute a misconduct, yet to increase harm to the individual who had thought was engaging in something perfectly fair and or just, and was now put in the situation to experience psychological distress, concerned with a potential misdemeanor and or serious conviction that could be brought upon them before the justice of the peace to evaluate more fairly and deliberately whether an individual had engaged in a sexual misconduct and or sexual harassment and or rape. Meaning that to engage in revoking consent after the sexual conduct concerning that consent has been conducted is invalid. Only the consent prior existing to the conduct is meaningful, albeit had somebody engaged in some sexual conduct during a series of intermissions, engaging in on and off consensual verbal and or non-verbal consent amongst the ongoing sexual conduct, may retract fairly and justly consent only concerning the clear verbal and or non-verbal communications. Never unclear and or vague as to ineffectively communicate the intra-categorical and or inter-categorical ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies. An individual may not more rationally be able to conduct the self appropriately with the lack of information not provided to them, meaning that there is a rational expectation a certain meaningful amount of information should be provided to be able to constitute the rational expectation to satisfy the as a must be good enough and necessary conditions to constitute meaningful consensual sexual conducts amongst sex with consent, and not non-consensual rape and or sexual harassment and or sexual misconduct. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keep looking at this episode.